Welcome to part 4 of personality theories. In this section, we're going to talk about the neo-Freudians, meaning the individuals that came after Freud. We're going to see two of them, Adler and Jung, who studied directly under Freud and broke away from Freud because they had different opinions on how personality evolves. And we're going to take a look at a third individual, a female, and look at some of her exceptions to Freudian theory. And we'll talk a little bit about analyzing the psychoanalytic perspective overall, as well as talk about how we assess the unconscious, and the infamous Rorschach inkblot card up here. So, anyways, let's head into it then. Okay, the first individual is Alfred Adler, another MD, trained back in Vienna as a physician, and he was part of Freud's original inner circle. He was handpicked by Freud when he started his first psychoanalytic society in Vienna to come and join the study group, and was very close to Sigmund Freud. In fact, at the time, Sigmund Freud was looking at Adler almost as a son, and potentially somebody who would carry on the cause after Freud would pass away. So, however, while Adler agreed with Freud about early childhood tensions, he disagreed that they were all psychosexual, and felt that there was, more social overtones to this. And, as we'll see, is one of the things that Freud is criticized for, really maybe overemphasizing too much parents, not looking enough at peer influences and things like that. And putting too much on the sexual development rather than looking at environmental forces. And this is what Alfred Adler was really, coming into more or less differ with Freud, is that he felt that, the environment around us influences us. And yes, there are these early conflicts that can help shape and mold the personality, but the environment in which we live, and as we continue to grow, particularly beyond 6 years of age, can influence our personalities significantly. And so Adler disagreed on that particular point. And because of his social influence, a lot of people will refer to Alfred Adler as the first social psychologist, because he emphasized how our social settings influence our development. One of the big components of Adler's theory was the notion of inferiority and the struggling with inferiority over our lifetime. Alfred Adler, in his early years, was, I guess what we might call a sickly child. He suffered from a lot of early diseases, and I think, in his own development, he realized how inferior he was. But he felt that when we were born, that we all had this striving for superiority, that we wanted to be superior, we wanted to be dominant over our environment and our world around us, and we desired to have power. And one of the things from his own personal life, then, by being sick as a young child, he realized that he was anything but superior, in fact, maybe inferior, and that he really was somewhat powerless. He had to rely on other individuals to, help him through, take care of him, things like that. And he felt that this developed then an inferiority complex within us. And he goes on to talk about that although we strive for superiority and we want to be superior, that we have this inferiority complex. And this has been extended out, by Adler to talk about why we create leaders. And that is that we turn to leaders who are more powerful, supposedly more superior than we are, to be able to help us out in those times of need. And this has been taken all the way out. In applying this principle is to the notion of God. And some people have used Adler's notion of this inferiority complex and how we turn to look for superior individuals in our life to help us out when we're feeling powerless, to more or less say, rather than God creating man, that man may have in fact created God due to our inferiority. And periodically you'll hear ministers and reverends, preach from the pulpit more or less against this notion that Alfred Adler, put into motion through this particular theory. Adler himself really at this time was not, attempting to challenge religion or challenge that there is a God. He was more or less taking a look at just this phenomenon of how we feel inferior. And in those times where we're feeling inferior and powerless, we turn to greater powers, whether that be political leaders, religious leaders, or, in the case of even, God or a higher being or higher power. So anyways, that is Alfred Adler. And talking about just his emphasis on the social influences, Adler developed for psychotherapy what we refer to today as the Adlerian interview. And he felt that you really didn't understand a person until you had their complete social history. And in the Adlerian interview, which is quite extensive, you ask about, their parents, you ask about their siblings, you ask about their grandparents, aunts, uncles. You'll ask them about people who have played a very positive, encouraging role in life, people who have played maybe a less so role in life, in the sense of those that have been kind of distractors or discouraging and that. But he looked to find out all the variables about your social context in order to make an evaluation, where, Sigmund Freud was more or less interested in, what are these unconscious thoughts and drives you got buried beneath, and let's use a little bit of free association and dreams. So that's one of the differences that existed between Adler and that. But as we talked about, that Freud, he didn't have any room for people who weren't on the page, 100% with them and disagreed with them. And Adler found himself being removed from that inner circle and the Psychoanalytic Society. Around this time, too, it was Karen Horney, or Horney, actually. And like Adler, she also believed in the social aspects of childhood growth and development. And she really was, I guess you might say, upset about and really, argued strongly against Freud's notion that women develop weak moral character due to lack of development of a strong superego because of the inability to fully resolve the electric complex, not having that ability to identify as the male does. And she took quite objection that women suffer from penis envy as well. So, but she was a major force, looking once again at the social context. She looked a lot at the interaction between children and their parents, and the early establishment of trust in a relationship, and how that early bonding could later affect us in our relationships with others. Another Neo-Freudian, Carl Jung, a very famous psychologist, also trained as an MD, differentiated from Freud in the sense that he believed in a collective unconscious. Now, Carl Jung also studied under Sigmund Freud some years after Adler. I think we were talking around about 1907, 1912. Both Adler and Jung were more or less involved in that Freudian inner circle, but here Carl Jung, what he found is that the unconscious isn't this warehouse of just negative thoughts and ideas, things that we're repressing down because they cause us pain and hurt. He found that it was a reservoir of all memories, and not just our present memories in life, but even of past species, ancestral memories that, through our genes we've inherited the memories of our moms and dads, and they have the memories of their parents, and so those are with us, and our great-grandparents, and so on and so on. And he felt that, these memories went way, way back to even pre-human experiences. And he would talk about, things like, well, why are we afraid of snakes? And he would say that somewhere back in our past, maybe we had evolved from a bird where the snake was a natural predator, and that it brought up this very primitive ancestral fear of snakes. And that he also believed that, with those inherited personalities come various themes. Adler was brought up from a very religious family. His father was a minister. He had 12 uncles who were ministers, as well as his grandfather. And so he was always exposed to a lot of the great religious writings and Greek mythology and things like that. And one of the things that he observed over time in reading was that there were certain personality types that seemed to repeat. There are always those heroic figures, as well as there were more or less those demonic figures as well. There was always, the powerful positive individual and the powerful negative evil individual. And he started to look at it. He said, no matter how far back in these writings you go, Old Testament, things like that, you see these repetitive personalities. And he was wondering, how do they come? Where do they come from? And what his assessment was is that they come out of our unconscious mind. They're products of our ancestral memories. And where we may desire to be otherwise, we have these memories of acting this way. And this is what influences our behavior. So, in this case, Carl Jung, too, would also be very interested in what are, those images that you have in your past, those major roles, those personalities, and taking a look at how they shape you. And this is the work that Carl Jung did. He also was very big in developing the concepts of introversion and extroversion. He also came up with the notion about personality, that within all of us, there is a masculine and feminine personalities. He referred to the anima and the animus, the anima being feminine and animus being masculine. Yeah, this is one of the things that he felt that, it's naturally part of us. It's part of our ancestral memories. I've inherited from my mother memories of being a woman. I've inherited, memories from my dad of being a man, and it's natural there. And he felt that our expression of our masculinity or femininity was based on the power of either the animus, the masculine side, or anima, the female side. And so, maybe a male who is somewhat effeminate, to Carl Jung, he just said, well, his anima is stronger than his animus. And, these ancestral memories that are stored in the collective conscious are more prominent. And this is what leads an individual to act that way. And to Carl Jung, he wouldn't be really that concerned about it, because he figured this was somewhat natural, because it's part of the personalities that we've inherited. So, anyways, kind of Carl Jung then. When we take a look at assessing the unconscious, can we study it? How do we know what's going on in the unconscious? Sigmund Freud has developed his free association. He uses dreams. Another major concept that he had were Freudian slips, where you make that mistake. You may be asking somebody for a pencil, and you say, hand me the pencil. And Freud would go, ooh, okay, hidden feelings are coming out here from an unconscious about penis, and he would make a big deal of it, where it may have been just a slip of the tongue, but to Freud these slip of the tongues were very important. Okay, but other ways, people have come up with some rather ingenious ways of studying the unconscious, and we'll take a look at two that are what we refer to as projective techniques. Now, a projective test, supposedly, what we do is project into it our hidden unconscious thoughts and feelings. Okay, and we'll take a look at these. The first one is the Rorschach test, developed by Hermann Rorschach. And this test was actually developed kind of serendipitously, in that he had a very boring patient that he was working with, and you get those at times where they just talk about the same thing each and every time, nothing new. And this was back in the time when we had the old ink pens and ink wells, and generally on a desk you would have what was called a blotter, so that under your papers and that, so if you dropped ink it wouldn't, you know, hit on your top of your desk, but you had this kind of, you know, absorbent paper that, you know, would soak it up. And apparently he was playing around with his pen during this boring interview, dropped some ink on top of his desktop blotter, and simply pulled the sheet out, folded it over, and ran his hand down where the ink drop had hit, and kind of, you know, more or less for him, unconsciously opened it up, and he's got this ink blot image there now. And sure enough, the guy across from him starts telling him what the ink blot looks like, and, you know, picking out different things. You know, you're looking at this one here on screen, and, you know, do you see a bug? You know, can you see individuals? Things like that. What do you see? And based on this, what he was able to do was to see that, you know, the person was projecting some of these unconscious thoughts or feelings into the interpretation. And so the ink blots took off, and eventually Herman developed 10 ink blots. Most of them are just black and white like you see. There's a couple with black with red ink, and then there are a couple multicolored ones that are more or less you know, what we might say in kind of fall or autumn colors and that. Nothing real dramatic, but when we ask a person to sit down and look at it, and it's a way of you know, getting people to communicate with you. The ink blots, though, are very difficult to interpret, and they vary from psychologist to psychologist or assessor to assessor about, you know, how valid they are and how you interpret the findings and things like that. So it's still used today. There are psychiatrists and psychologists that use them. Personally, in my private practice, no. I've taken courses in it, but I have not found it to be as reliable and valid as using other forms of psychological assessment, which we'll talk more about when we get to the trait theory part of this chapter in our next section. The thematic apperception test is an additional form of projective technique, and one that probably, if I had to pick one or the other to use, I like this one. And what you can see that there over here is a picture of a picture or an image that we would show an individual, and they're kind of on sturdy cardboard paper, and you see this woman here, and you see kind of the body posture, her hand up around her face, her head lowered. You see this gentleman, you know, sitting in the bed, and, you know, what you ask a person is, you know, what is going on here, and what led up to it, and what will be the outcome. And supposedly in trying to interpret this, they will project their own personal life, their experiences, their feelings into it. You know, is the man dead? Is he merely sick? Is he sleeping? You know, her out here crying. Is she crying because he died? Did she kill him? Or maybe they just had an argument, and he's very dismayed, and he's turned his head away from her, and she's outside maybe, you know, crying for what he maybe said, or she's dismayed about what she said. There are all sorts of different ways that an individual can go with this, and what you do is you listen to the stories that they tell you as they project themselves in. Now, you know, obviously if you get somebody who's very highly creative and imaginative, well, then they may come up with these elaborate stories that have nothing to do with their interpersonal feelings or unconscious thoughts or drives. But this is one of the things that he did, is he used these rather ambiguous pictures. Interestingly enough, most of the pictures he used were from real artwork that he found. And the way he discovered this, actually, it was by happenstance. He was standing outside a theater with his wife waiting in line for tickets. And, you know, they have the theater posters posted up, and his wife was looking at this picture of one of the posters, and all of a sudden she started to tell him what was going on in this picture. And what he realized is, from knowing her as well as he did, is that her interpretation was going on represented past events in her life and her feelings and her emotions emotions. And this is what got him interested in using this as an assessment technique. And the TATs are still used as well. And it's a good way too when somebody's being kind of inexpressive, not giving you a lot, as they ask them, tell me what this is. And you can use it almost as conversation starter as well as a psychological assessment. Okay, when we take a look at projective techniques overall, the critics argue that they lack both reliability, which is consistency of results. Will one psychologist come up with the same results as another psychologist, as another psychologist, as another psychologist? How consistent will those interpretations be? As well as the validity, does it really predict? Does it predict our unconscious thoughts and drives and feelings? Are these our true feelings? Once again, it's like I was saying with the TAT cards, the thematic apperception test, is that you get somebody who's highly creative. Are they just telling you a big story, or does it in fact truly project their inner feelings? And that's when we come down and say, is it really a valid measure of one's unconscious thoughts or feelings? Okay, so we can just see here, when evaluating the same patient, even trained raters come up with different interpretations, and that shows then low reliability, which we're very skeptical of, and that they may at times misdiagnose a normal individual as pathological, and it comes down to the validity, particularly when you get that really creative mind and they're really telling you a yarn, but you're thinking that, hey, this is a manifestation of their internal feelings. We may come up with a diagnosis. One of my older daughters, she loves watching, a lot of these dark movies, and probably if she was to look at one of those, from the influence of just the dark movies and the books that she reads, she may come up with a really dark interpretation that may really alarm us, but doesn't really truly represent her personality. And you get to know her, you realize she has anything but a dark personality, but she may creatively go into thinking about this, how this relates to a vampire story, or witches and warlock type story that she's read or something, and really come up with a doozy that all of a sudden has you quite alarmed. Okay, evaluating the psychoanalytic perspective, where do we stand? Okay, one of the things is that modern research takes to task the psychoanalytic perspective, in that personality develops throughout the lifespan and is not necessarily fixed in early childhood. It doesn't negate that early childhood years are very important in building the foundation. And if you don't get a good foundation, anything you build on top of that later is always going to be questionable. There's always going to be shaky. And so, but we do know that personality does develop and continues to evolve, across the lifespan, and events and experiences that we encounter, individuals influence our personality. The belief is, too, that Freud underemphasized, peer influences on the individual. And so, he really didn't take into any of the social context and how others influence us. And it was more or less based on the parental influences and our identification or lack of identification. As we'll see too, the research shows that people grow up perfectly healthy in maybe a single-sex family environment where only we have a single parent, just a mom or a dad there, because that was one of the questions to say, well, what happens if you got little boys that are being raised by their mom? There's no father for them to turn and identify with. The notion is, will they develop this feminine identity, and will that lead them to be homosexual? And that was one of the things that Freud was focused in on. And what we find is a lot of these little boys, the vast majority of them turn out to identify perfectly well as masculine. In fact, whether you're masculine or not really doesn't moderate whether you're going to be gay or not. There are effeminate men that are very heterosexual, and there are very masculine men, people who play football and rugby and things like that, who are, gay and that. But the thing is here is that, Freud, really placed a lot of emphasis on this parental influence and this identification, these power figures. And, today in our single parent family environment, back in Freud's day, those were very, very rare. Today, was it over 50% of the families are raised by, are headed up by a single parent. Freud felt that gender identity may develops around 6 or 7 after we've gone through that phallic stage and dealing with identification. Yet we find that talking to individuals with gender dysphoria type of disorders, that many of them knew much even earlier on that there was something different about them. They're little boys who are transgendered, who feel that they're a female trapped in a male's body. Say that from 3-4 years of age, when they started to play with toys, that they didn't relate to the masculine toys. They related more to the feminine toys. They wanted to play with Barbie rather than G.I. Joe and things like that. And so there's evidence to support that gender identity may be there very early on. In fact, gender identity may actually have some biological underpinnings, such as we talked about back when we were talking about the development of the hypothalamus. Okay. There may be other reasons for dreams besides wish fulfillment. Back in our States of Consciousness chapter, we talked about dreams, how they help consolidate memories. We came back and talked about that just in the last chapter too, as well as that when we dream about things at night, we believe that is the brain processing information, going through and sorting away all that imagery that has come in during the day. Verbal slips, those Freudian slips that Freud talked about, is they may just be verbal processing errors. Maybe where you're thinking 2 thoughts at the same time, and what you wind up doing is combining 2 words. And just as simple as that, and not any deep, found expression of unconscious feelings. And that suppressed sexuality, we find today, leads to psychological disorders, and that sexual inhibition has, even where sexual inhibition has decreased over the years, but the psychological disorders have not. And today he felt that because we couldn't talk about sex, that led to problems. Well, today we can talk about sex pretty openly, male and female alike, and we still have disorders. So something else is going on there. Okay. Overall, Freud's theory, heavily rests upon the notion of repression. And one of the things is that we found is that repression is not such a universal thing. And, like you look at here, the majority of children, death camp survivors, battle-scarred veterans are unable to repress painful memories or experiences into their unconscious. And that, when you look at a lot of the people who survived 9/11, a lot of them is very clear. And, they lost people, or, they lost loved ones. They themselves may have been involved, and they still have those memories. And so repression is not this universal truth that we take everything that's hurt and painful and we shove it back down that long hallway into that, big closet in the back of our mind. Okay. The modern unconscious mind, from looking at current researches, that here are some of the results, and you can take a look through them. I don't think I need to go through them, one by one here, but then you can look through these on your own in the slide set. And one of the things in the end is that the merits of Freud's theory today, they very heavily criticized that psychoanalysis is noted here as meagerly testable. It's very difficult to test out what actually is going on with the unconscious, and that most of the concepts that he developed arose out of clinical practice, and more or less were ex post facto, or after the fact type of explanations for what was going on, and not necessarily predictive of what would go on. Even with all this and all the criticism and everything else, as we started off this lecture, back in the beginning, is saying that Freud is one of the most prominent psychologists that everybody thinks about, and we use his terms readily in our daily lexicon: libido, ego, superego, id, repression, regression. All these various terms that Freud developed are still very much in existence, and we use them in describing individuals and behavior. Okay, that wraps up our discussion on psychoanalytic theory, and we'll come back and talk about the humanist, a much more bright and cheery perspective.